I'm Dr. Esther Nambakwe, a senior lecturer in the Department of Child Health and Pediatrics, Moi University, Kenya. My presentation is on the role of anthropology in young infant feeding, which is part of my publication in the International Journal of Science and Research, which was published in the year 2015. This slide shows an outline of my presentation. I'll briefly go through definitions, background information, method, results, discussion, conclusions, and acknowledgement. Definitions. Anthropology is the study of humans, past and present, focusing on comparative study of culture and society. Social refers to conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, including health systems. Culture is the complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, and custom, which affect the way of life of members of a society. Triangulation is a combination of at least two theoretical perspectives, methodological approaches, data sources, investigators, or data analysis methods in research. Amenorrhea is cessation of periods after established menstruation, and lactation is production of breast milk. Background. Infant feeding is crucial for growth and development of the child and the entire nation. Feeding decisions, practices, and success are determined by contextual socioculture, socioeconomics, politics, maternal health, physiological and psychological status. Sub-Saharan Africa is unique due to ecological and cultural diversity, poor sanitation, lack of clean water, poverty, and a high prevalence of HIV. These factors must be considered as young infant feeding interventions are planned and evaluated before public health policies are set. Over the last 2 decades, control of mother-to-child transmission of HIV resulted into varied policy changes in young infant feeding. The focus was mainly the reduction of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, with less emphasis on sociocultural, socioeconomic, and psychological consequences. Anthropologists examine the broad context of young infant feeding, considering biological and cultural dimensions in a single framework. Anthropological studies on young infant feeding employ varied research techniques, types of data sources, and underlying theoretical models leading to different policy implications. However, researchers in health education, interventional nutrition, clinical nursing, or public health have had the most influence on young infant feeding policy. There is need to triangulate research by pediatricians and other stakeholders to better inform policy on young infant feeding based on contextual variation. Method. A narrative literature review was conducted to determine the magnitude of anthropological and pediatric research triangulation to create awareness of the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration on young infant feeding. The search engines were Cochrane Library, PubMed, Medline, and Google Scholar. The search terms were research on infant feeding among HIV-infected mothers. And the inclusion criteria were studies on young infant feeding in the context of HIV, co-authored by anthropologists and pediatricians during the period 2000 and 2014. Results. Google Scholar yielded an inventory of 3 studies at the University of Malawi, none of which were co-authored by anthropologists and pediatricians. However, one of the studies, which was on the status of carotenoids, vitamin A, vitamin E in mother-infant diets, and anthropometric status of infants in Malawi, was co-authored by anthropologists, obstetrician and gynecologists, and a pediatrician. Discussion. Young infant feeding is a behavior subject to contextual variation depending on prevailing sociocultural, socioeconomic, ecological, environmental, and political circumstances. Paradoxically, the more breastfeeding is valued, the more it may be embedded in patterns of interaction and connected to infant feeding. The unique contribution of anthropology is examination of the broad context in which infant feeding decisions are made, considering biological and cultural dimensions in a single framework. Sociocultural anthropology focuses on issues touching on all aspects of life, including health, work, ecology and environment, education, agriculture, and social development. It examines social patterns and practices across cultures and is concerned with similarities and differences of societies, race, sexuality, class, gender, and nationality. Biological anthropologists demonstrated an evolutionary basis of hormonal response that stimulates uterine contraction and production of milk after birth and variation in weaning age. Historical sources provide evidence for the temporal variability of infant feeding practices and can be used with ethnographic evidence to suggest the best contextual infant feeding options. Medical records from the 17th to the 18th century showed how changing patterns of breastfeeding reflected changing views about the appropriate roles of women and mothers. Between 1860 and 1930, archival evidence showed that mortality of children not breastfed was 3 times that of those who were breastfed, and that the protective effect on infant survival continued after weaning. Ethnographic work by Pantabrick in Nepal demonstrated that women may work slightly shorter hours in the fields when they are breastfeeding, otherwise breastfeeding is inadequate. During the period of breastfeeding, mothers are subjected to conflicting interests of breastfeeding, fending for the family, and having to work. This may cause psychological, physical, and emotional stress to the mother. And if the baby is not adequately breastfed, there might be malnutrition, which will result into increased infant mortality in our setting. For centuries, intellectual, human resource, and financial efforts have been spent on studies reporting similar results rather than collaborative multidisciplinary research involving anthropologists. Let us look at the African culture and infant feeding. Choice of infant feeding has to be culturally acceptable, affordable, feasible, and sustainable. This is the first criteria. The society expects all mothers to breastfeed except in case of incest. In the African setting, more than 95% of infants are currently breastfed, but feeding water and other liquids is a widespread practice. Early introduction of other foods and herbs at 1 week to 3 months of age is the norm, which is contrary to WHO recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, regardless of maternal HIV status. The belief is that infants thrive better and they get accustomed to family food. And this allows mothers to work and participate in compulsory cultural activities such as burial and marriage ceremonies. Among the Yoruba in Nigeria, exclusive breastfeeding is believed to be dangerous to the infant, and supplementary water has to be given to quench thirst and promote normal development. Herbal teas serve as medicine, whereas colostrum is discarded because it is thought to be dirty like pus and harmful to the infant. In Kwa-Zulu Natal, South Africa, social stigma of HIV infection, maternal age and family influences on feeding practices, economic circumstances, beliefs about HIV transmission through breast milk, and beliefs about quality of breast milk influenced feeding decisions. Success of infant feeding depends on community beliefs and practices. Postpartum taboos, such as sexual abstinence during breastfeeding, was believed to ensure good quality of breast milk, guaranteed good infant growth, prolonged lactational amenorrhea, and thus enhanced child spacing. Polygamy was encouraged to meet the sexual needs of the men during this period. And during pregnancy, mothers may stop breastfeeding due to the belief that the milk is harmful to the infant. Among the Chaga in Tanzania, child malnutrition is a sign of ancestral dysplasia attributed to parental sexual misconduct. Breastfeeding while pregnant is considered dangerous because semen would spoil breast milk. Importance of postpartum abstinence during breastfeeding illustrates the linkage between food and sex. Feeding the mouth maintains life, while feeding the vagina during sexual intercourse produces life. One must not have been feeding the vagina of the mother at the same time she is feeding the mouth of the infant. In Busia County of Western Kenya, young women did not breastfeed due to the fear of their breasts falling and losing shape, and thus lose attraction to potential husbands. This explained why breastfeeding was particularly low among teenage mothers in the county. Similarly, Western culture is obsessed with sexual nature of women's breasts, their role in attracting and keeping male attention, and their role in providing sexual pleasure for men and women. What is the role of anthropology in young infant feeding? Anthropology emphasizes on participant observation by placing oneself in the research context for extended periods to gain first-hand sense of how local knowledge is translated into practice. Ethnographic studies using life histories, observation, focus group discussions, and in-depth interviews inform on why, where, what, when, how, and by whom infants are fed. This yields a better understanding of why infants are fed in certain ways in varied ecological, sociocultural, and socioeconomic contexts. Ethnographic studies increase understanding of cultural dynamics, leading to better framing of health education messages to facilitate understanding and hence acceptability. Anthropology, therefore, links the community, implementers of projects, and funders. What's the role of anthropological theories? Anthropological research generates theories that explain human behavior, such as breastfeeding, which constitutes practices with extraordinary temporal and spatial variation. Theory aids in learning rapidly what works by evaluating grassroots efforts in communities before implementation of programs and policies to improve health. Intervention strategies based on theory are therefore most promising. Theories of health behavior identify the targets of change and the methods for accomplishing these changes. Theories also inform the evaluation of change efforts by helping to identify outcomes to be measured, as well as timing the methods of study to be used. Intervention programs to influence health behavior, including health promotion and education, will benefit communities if guided by a theory of health behavior. What is the role of multidisciplinary research in young infant feeding? Multidisciplinary research by anthropologists and health professionals can build on disciplinary differences, producing work that best informs policy. This can only be achieved through multidisciplinary triangulation of research to produce best evidence. Triangulation decreases or counterbalances the deficiencies of a single strategy. It increases the ability to interpret findings, and it strengthens the basis on which infant feeding policy changes are made. This picture is a summary of the current research situation in our setting. As you can see, all passengers are researchers from different disciplines, but similar destination, which is the goal of promoting, supporting, and sustaining optimum young infant feeding. Those inside the train have published in different discipline-oriented conferences and journals. Those hanging outside are researchers whose findings are not yet published. And then the ones in the background are still in the field, collecting data to achieve the same goal. A situation which we should try to avoid by triangulation of research, which includes multidisciplinary investigators. Conclusions. Collaboration between anthropologists and pediatricians in research on young infant feeding is inadequate. Infant feeding policy changes need triangulation of research between pediatricians and anthropologists, among other stakeholders, to enhance understanding of sociocultural, socioeconomic, political, environmental, and ecological contexts. Efforts to promote, support, and sustain optimum young infant feeding will not succeed without multidisciplinary integration of research activities and findings from medicine, anthropology, social sciences, economics, politics, with social culture. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge Moi University and the Consortium for Advanced Research Training in Africa for awarding me the PhD Fellowship Scholarship and supporting the research. CARTA is jointly led by the African Population and Health Research Center and the University of the Witwatersrand. The scholarship was funded by the Wellcome Trust, Department for International Development under the Development Partnerships in Higher Education, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, Google.org, CEDA, and MacArthur Foundation. Thank you.